Good morning and welcome to the Innovation Studio here at Dartmouth College in the Jones Media Center. I'm Memory Apata and I'm here with Jed Dobson and Don Pease to talk about some of the discussions you've been having in Yellow Dig on our course, some really interesting ones this week. We'll start with the Scarlet Letter and start with the beginning of the Scarlet Letter, the preface. A lot of our students have been having some different opinions about the preface. Some really love it and some just really hate it. And I'm noticing that a lot of the second time and third time readers of the preface are finding it really useful. And some are wondering even if Hawthorne was telling the truth about finding a Scarlet Letter in the attic of the Customs House. What do you think was going on there?
Yeah, and there's a number of questions we can think about, and putting the preface next to the body of the text. There are two different genres active in the preface and the body of the text itself, and there's two different modes of time or even temporality. Traditionally, the preface is something that's written after a work. In the case of the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne was working on the Custom House preface at the same time he was writing the text of the Scarlet Letter. You can see that in the body of the text itself of the Custom House preface when he alludes to these additional stories that would come. It's a way, his preface, of describing what he's doing within his work. It's what we could call a scene of writing, which is maybe a little off-putting to some people, because we're kind of confused. What is he doing? He's defining his art. He's explaining it to his readers, what he does and how he produces his art. It's his attempt in the Scarlet Letter to become a major author, capital A author. And one way of doing that is to write this preface and kind of set himself forward as a serious artist. It is a different genre, as I said. It's more autobiographical. Hawthorne doesn't give us much in terms of autobiography. We get a couple of prefaces. There's one to the House of Seven Gables as well. There's some journals, but otherwise we know very little about Hawthorne in his own words about himself. So it has interest for that, for readers who want to know more about Hawthorne. But the question of is it really autobiography is interesting. Within the preface itself, when he's describing what his art is, he defines the romance as a genre that's kind of in between the actual and the imaginary. And I think we could use those two terms to think about the preface itself. It's somewhere in between. There's a scene of him working in the Custom House. He was working in the Custom House. He did lose his job. And he describes going up to the second story and discovering this letter. The Scarlet Letter, right, which is in his telling, the imaginative prompt for the story itself. I think, always for me as someone who does work on autobiography, the question of it being true or not is something I'm not as interested in as much as what is this thing doing for him? What's it doing for Hawthorne? What is the work of something that claims to be autobiographical doing for the author? It's doing a lot for Hawthorne. It's creating his imagination. It's guiding us through the Custom House. If we notice, the first chapter of the Scarlet Letter itself is a door opening, right? We're going through the Custom House into the body of the text. It's getting him into the mode of romance. It's also taking us, right, from the world of the real into the imaginary. I think that's what's fascinating about it. It's an opening into the text. I know many people might be put off.
Do you think that defining your art in that way sort of closes off certain interpretations? A lot of students were talking about the ambiguity of the letter A. If you're going to go ahead and define your art, is that closing off some of that openness?
I don't think so at all. I think we're able to find multiple ways into the text beyond just let's say that one doorway, the biographical. We could do, and many critics have, sort of biographical reading of the text that follows and say, okay, well, what this text is about is Hawthorne's working out from trying to find a way to get out of the sins of his fathers, right? But I don't think so. I don't think the preface does that work either of limiting us. I think when we read it, we're gaining an expansive understanding of Hawthorne. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, for the sake of the course, it's a clear turning point moment.
Sure.
Because it's the moment in which Hawthorne, who has sacrificed his artistic talent in order to become a custom house official, is literally recovering his vocation as an artist by way of discovering what's missing, not only from the custom house sensibility, but from the readership that has been flattened in its sensibility by way of the routines that the custom house officers follow. So in this moment in which Hawthorne is giving up his public identity as a custom house official in order to recover what he now understands to be his authentic identity as an artist and as a writer, Hawthorne is finding the means by which he will undergo this transition in his identity through an uncovering of a figure that could be understood to be linked to the official documents of the custom house, the figure of a letter that falls out as if it's a piece of debris from the custom house attic, something that needs the imagination of a writer in order to be returned to life. So Hawthorne quite literally feels the reality of his return to his authentic life by way of a figure that requires the reality of the imagination to be restored to vivid representation. So if your question is the disjunction between reality and romance, I think Hawthorne would want to nuance the question by calling attention to the need to retrieve a romance with reality in order to understand the reality of romance and the imagination that fosters it.
I think that brings us really well into our next question, which sort of harkens back to a figure in reality, Anne Hutchinson. And a lot of our students have been talking about her and Hester Prynne as sort of independent female characters that really might have been considered a turning point in the mid-19th century in women's rights. And a lot of our students were wondering a little bit about the historical context of that question. Was Hawthorne actually trying to make a statement about women's rights in the mid-19th century?
Well, in the 19th century, just 2 years prior to Hawthorne's publication of the Scarlet Letter, there was a convention, women's rights convention, held in Seneca Falls, in which there was a declaration of sentiment as the core of the, let's call it, freedom that women wanted to exercise in a world in which values of the patriarchy had produced divisions of psychic, material, and intellectual labor that always worked to the deficit of women. So Hawthorne in 1850 is interested in locating the historical basis in the United States for that attitude. And he finds it in the Puritan past, in which the patriarchate had, through the judgment that resulted in certain women being designated as witches and forcibly removed from the Puritan community, the location of a crime against humanity in general, and women in particular, that his contemporary 19th century culture had inherited. So in order to undo that legacy of patriarchal oppression, he decided to take a figure who was linked not only to Anne Hutchinson, but by way of his lived biography, to his ancestors, who had been themselves responsible for the designation of women like Hester Prynne as witches to be burned or hanged or otherwise executed in the Puritan community. Now, notice what he does with the figure of Hester Prynne. Although she is the figure upon whom the Puritans have imposed the letter of their judgment, sentenced her to become objectified, hence rendered civilly dead by representing only the sin of adultery. Notice how Hester, instead of agreeing to bear the significance of that sentence on her person, accepts the letter with the understanding that she can revise its significance by living a life that calls attention to the disjunction between the objectifying sentence the Puritan fathers had imposed upon her and the subject of desire, who can live a life that is otherwise than that of the Puritan fathers had sentenced. And notice her primary strategy. The Puritan fathers depend upon the identity of the father as the basis for maintaining the power and security of the patriarchate. Hester has a child. She refuses to name the father. And in refusing to give the name of the father, she renders every adult male in the Puritan community, every member of the Puritan patriarchy, susceptible to the designation of adulterer rather than the identity of the upstanding representative of the patriarchal order. Hester's initial gesture as a woman in the community is to produce a series of actions that call attention to the injustice of a community that takes pride in its revengeful, retributive, judgmental actions. The difference between that community of judgment and the community her presence in and among the Puritans will call into existence. A community of concernful care, a community that privileges mercy and tenderness and second thinking over judgment. It's that power that Hester Prynne exercises under the pain of judgment, despite the pain of judgment, that calls attention to the remarkable freedom that she's able to take out of the jaws of oppression. And she's able thereby, don't you think, Jed, to even turn the basic, let's call it, representation of the puritanical order, the nuclear family, mother, father, child, into a structure that she intends to redefine rather than to personify by living in the community as the single parent of Pearl, but not quite as Pearl's mother, but as a figure who establishes in her relationship with her daughter a bond that seems extraneous to, anomalous to, every one of the already existing representations of proper bonds in that order. Don't you think that Hester, on every level, is producing in her person, in her actions, in her thoughts, a way to reorder the Puritan community?
Oh yeah, I agree entirely. It's probably interesting to think about the spaces in which that is a possibility, though. Maybe Hawthorne's showing us some limitations, at least historically, or for some time. I'm thinking of the scenes we called our students' attention to with Hester and especially Dimmesdale and in the woods. And the woods seems to be the space where we see that relationship in its freest form, in its most radical form. Maybe that's kind of the limitation of Hawthorne's imagination, of the ability to redefine. Or he's saying it can happen within civil society at that point. But I love what you're saying.
But even in the wilderness, there's something that he ambiguates. Because when Dimmesdale makes the pledge to leave with Hester, as he's returning from the site of that tryst in the wilderness, it's as if his own psyche has received the contagion of a wildness voided of the, let's call it, ordering principle of love. And he begins to violate the privacy of every one of his parishioners, as if he's reproducing his crime against Hester after he's pledged his fidelity to her. There's something about the men, even in the spaces in which Hester would reorder that community, that renders them not quite equal to the task of reimagining.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely.
So in that sense, this text is feminist avant la lettre, even as it indicates Hawthorne's deep desire to become attuned to the inner sensibility of a character who's literally returned him to his true identity as a writer. Hester Prynne.
I have a lot more that I want to ask about this, but I think that we probably need to move on to Whitman. And we had a student who pointed out the different definitions of the words leaf and grass in this time period. I thought that was so interesting, and I looked up an engram of the word grass, which you talk about in a video I don't think our students have seen yet, about distance reading. But would you mind telling us what the different usages of those terms were and what significance?
What did you learn? What did you see?
So the use of the word grass just shoots up about 1840, and I mean, I'm sure there was grass before 1840, so there must be something important between 1840 and 1855, I think, when Leaves of Grass was published.
There's many ways we could go with that question. There'd be an ecological question, right? Grass is both something that's wild and also cultured, right? Behind us, we have the image of a space here at Dartmouth called the Bema, in which we see grass growing. Grass covers the common. When we think about the bare common for Emerson, we're wondering, is it barren of trees or grass? Is it dirt or is it filled with grass? Grass is incredibly common. It's growing wildly. It's covering all sorts of spaces, any space there is anything empty. Grass is something like what Deleuze and Guattari would call rhizome, right? Of just growing down and upward and outward in every which way. It's kind of anarchic, right? Leaves itself, as this person pointed out in the discussion forum, does refer to the leaves of paper. The leaves of grass are printed on. So in that way, we could think of leaves of grass as cataloging, collecting the poems, which could be grass themselves, and they could be common, or they could have maybe even an aggressive will to take over, right? There's something uncontainable about Whitman's poetry, right? That he continually, as we says, revising this book throughout his life and adding and desiring to represent all. I contain multitudes, right? There's this sort of wild anarchic nature in him. Grass is both natural and it's something else. Grass at times becomes the hairs of bodies. It becomes people. We talked a lot about in our videos and our request for annotations to think about the idea of the commonality of people in Whitman, and here we get that in nature. Grass would be something incredibly common. The poem begins the edition that we asked our students to read after the first opening. I celebrate myself with, I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. It's an invitation to come with Whitman and to lie back on perhaps something like this space.
It's just like, I just envision him wallowing kind of in the grass, just like rolling around in ecstasy.
It is ecstatic, yeah. It's also a hieroglyphic, right? Later in the poem, we get a reference to grass as a hieroglyph. It's something that he resists definition of. His child comes to him and says, "What is grass?" Right? And he's kind of resisting that. He wants to keep it open. It's just a fantastic place to go in a poem to this thing that seems most common, yet has the power really to encompass all.
Yeah, I think I'm wondering, like, when we're talking about multitudes, if he had said leaves of stars, first of all, that doesn't make sense. But I mean, it seems like when you look at the sky, you can almost number the stars. If you're looking out at the great expanse of America, you can't really say, you would never be able to even count a small space of grass.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, this passage I alluded to before, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven, right? It has this promise too at the same time, right? Hopeful green stuff.
He also calls it the journey work of the stars, a single leaf of grass, to call attention to the connection that you're making. Because he thinks that on earth, everything that we behold with wonder in the firmament is itself flourishing. If we want to imagine a counterpart for the multitudinous array of stars suddenly emerging into our field of perception, it's a field of grass, as Jed said. It's the suddenness, the wonder of it. Why is there anything at all? And then this. It's the miracle of the most common and ordinary of emergencies.
I think this is going to be a perfect way to wrap up this conversation, because we were talking earlier about reality and the imaginary in Scarlet Letter, and students were talking a lot about reality and the imaginary in Whitman. Is Whitman an idealist? Is he a realist? There are elements of both, like we're talking about with the grass. What ultimately do we think?
Well, if we think of the idealist as someone who has a whole set of thoughts just rambling around in his consciousness, separated from things, Whitman is not an idealist. If we think of a materialist or a realist as someone who accounts for things according to their utility in an economic market or their everyday use value, separated from their spiritual manifestations, then Whitman is not a materialist. But if we think of things and thoughts as necessarily referring to one another, then Whitman, as the poet, is the figure who discloses to things their relation to thoughts, and the figure who discloses to ideals and thoughts their deep rootedness in things. Everything that Professor Dobson called our attention to in Whitman's response to the children who ask, what is the significance of the grass? Whitman's response is twofold. To call attention to the wonder that informs the question, and to link that wonder to the entire display of the material splendor of vistas of fields of grass. Whitman once referred to himself as the true referee. He says in the preface to the 1855 edition, the present president is not the true referee, the representative of all of the members of the United States, all of the people. The poet is the true referee, because the poet is the figure who is capable of enabling every person who emerges into reality across the continent, the United States, enables every one of those individual manifestations of life to discover their rootedness in the supersensible firmament of spiritual potentiality that runs through all things. Whitman, when he's trying to himself think about the relationship between what he does as a poet and the question that you've raised. What's the poet's relation to things? How does he save the truth of the appearances of things? What's the poet's relationship to ideals? How does he remain true to those ideals without losing his connection to persons who have a vested stake in and an enjoyment of their everyday existence? Here's how Whitman begins to answer that question in section 13 of Song of Myself. In me, the caresser of life were ever moving, backward as well as forward slewing, to niches aside and juniors bending, not a person or object missing, absorbing all to myself and for this song. It's as if Whitman has planted himself, as Emerson asked that the poet do, right at the core of life, where that which is emerging into life and that which is removing itself from life begin to converge and to disclose those leavings and those comings, what it is that brought them into life and sustains them throughout life and sustains them as well in the life that exceeds the life that we enjoy when we call ourselves alive. That's the living, breathing poet who in every line of Leaves of Grass breathes out what is leaving life and inspires or breathes in what is coming into life and gives expression to both the inspiring and the expiring through the aspiration, the ongoing aspiration that is his song. Whitman's Leaves of Grass constitutes not only the means of sustaining the urgency of the question you've raised, but sustaining by way of the question what it is that discloses the mystery that that question at once solicits and sustains, the ongoing relationship between ideals and material things that Whitman calls the United States of America, the greatest poem. I think that when he does that, he's able to take not only the common leaf of grass and invest it with super sensible significance. He's able to take a piece of sand, a mollusk shell, a twig off of the mud on the soles of his feet, and invest that detail, that piece which would otherwise, like the Scarlet Letter, fall out of recognizable existence, and sustain it with a song that seems to require it in order to continue.
It's wonderful.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. I hope y'all enjoy next week. Well, we've already started Melville, but we're giving you time to read it, and we will see you on the discussion boards. I'm Memory Apata.
And I'm Don Pease, and I hope you see the Whitman, the Hawthorne, the Emerson, the Douglas as you're reading and rereading Moby Dick.
I'm Jed Dobson. Thank you.
Thanks.